The sound of champagne glasses clinking echoed through the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, but to me, it felt like funeral bells. I stood frozen in the doorway, my modest black dress suddenly feeling like sackcloth against the sea, of designer gowns and perfectly sculpted faces around me. The invitation in my trembling hand read, "Michael and Victoria's engagement party." But what I hadn't expected was to see my own husband of 15 years announcing his engagement to another woman. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael's voice boomed across the room, his arm wrapped possessively around a stunning blonde who couldn't have been older than 25. I'd like you all to meet my beautiful fiancée, Victoria Sinclair. The world tilted sideways. 15 years of marriage, and I was finding out about our divorce the same way as 200 strangers in evening wear. My throat closed as I watched. Him lean down to kiss her perfectly glossed lips, the same lips that had never known the exhaustion of staying up all night with a sick child, or the worry lines that came from stretching every dollar to build the life we once shared. That's when he saw me. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe. Or perhaps just annoyance that his carefully orchestrated evening had been disrupted. He whispered something to Victoria, handed her his champagne glass, and began making his way toward me through the crowd. "Elena?" He said my name like it was something distasteful he needed to spit out. "What are you doing here?" I held up the invitation with hands that refused to stop shaking. Jenny Morrison sent this to me. She thought I should know. Michael's jaw tightened. Jenny had been our mutual friend for over a decade, and apparently she'd grown tired of his lies about our amicable separation that I'd known nothing about. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he hissed, grabbing my elbow and steering me toward a quieter corner near the French doors that led to the garden. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself?" The words came out louder than I intended, causing several nearby guests to turn and stare. "You announced your engagement without bothering to mention you were getting divorced. When exactly were you planning to tell me, Michael? At the wedding?" His face hardened into the expression I'd seen more and more frequently over the past few years, the one that made me feel smaller than the dust beneath his Italian leather shoes. "Keep your voice down. These people don't need to witness your hysterics." Hysterics? I felt something crack inside my chest, something that had been holding together by pure force of will for longer than I cared to admit. "My husband of 15 years is engaged to another woman, and you think I'm being hysterical? Elena, please." He glanced nervously toward Victoria, who was watching us with obvious curiosity from across the room. "You're making a scene. These are important people, business contacts. I can't have you here looking like that." The words hit me like a physical blow. I followed his gaze down to my dress, the one I'd thought looked elegant when I'd put it on 2 hours ago. It was black, simple, appropriate for what I'd assumed would be a somber conversation about why my husband had been working late every night for the past 6 months. Now, surrounded by women dripping in jewels and designer labels, I felt like a crow among peacocks. "Looking like what exactly?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Michael's eyes swept over me with undisguised distaste. "Elena, look at yourself. Look at what you've become. When was the last time you bought a new dress? When did you last do something with your hair? You've let yourself go completely." Each word was a carefully aimed arrow, finding its mark in every insecurity I'd carried for years. The weight I'd gained after our daughter Sarah was born and never quite lost. The gray streaks I'd been meaning to cover but never found time for between working 2 jobs and managing our household. The lines around my eyes that had deepened during the sleepless nights when Michael claimed he was traveling for business. "I've been working 60 hours a week to keep our house," I whispered, the fight draining out of me. "I've been raising our daughter while I've been building a business that supports both of you," he cut me off. "While I've been networking with people who matter, people who can actually help us move up in the world. Do you think Victoria would be caught dead in a dress from Target?" The comparison stung because it was true. Victoria's dress probably cost more than I made in a month at the insurance office. Her skin glowed with the kind of radiance that came from expensive facials and stress-free living. Her hair fell in perfect waves that whispered of weekly salon appointments I couldn't afford. "I bought this dress for our anniversary last year," I said quietly. "You said I looked beautiful in it." I was being kind. The words fell between us like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never quite settle. "Elena, I need you to understand something. Victoria comes from a certain kind of family. Her father owns half the commercial real estate in this city. These people, they have standards. They have expectations. And I don't meet them. No," he said simply, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than any elaborate lie would have been. "You don't. Look, I've tried to be patient. I've tried to help you improve yourself, but you seem content to stay exactly where you are. Victoria, she pushes me to be better. She understands the importance of image, of connections, of presenting the right face to the world." I felt something inside me crumble, the last remaining foundation of the life I'd thought we were building together. "So, you decided to replace me." "I decided to build a life with someone who could be a true partner," he corrected. "Someone who could stand beside me at events like this without me having to worry about what people are thinking." The cruelty of it took my breath away. For 15 years, I'd believed that marriage meant supporting each other through thick and thin, that love meant accepting someone's flaws and growing together. I'd weathered his bad moods, his criticism, his increasingly frequent absences, because I'd thought we were a team. I'd thought what we had was worth fighting for. "What about Sarah?" I asked, grasping for something solid in the ruins of my world. "What about our daughter?" "Sarah will be fine. She'll have 2 homes, 2 families, and honestly, Elena, maybe she needs to see what a successful woman looks like. Maybe she needs a better role model than someone who's given up on herself." The words were like acid on an open wound. Sarah was 16, beautiful, brilliant, and the one thing in my life I'd never doubted I was doing right. The idea that Michael saw me as a negative influence on our daughter was devastating beyond anything else he'd said. "I should go," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you should." He straightened his tie, already mentally returning to his party. "And Elena? Next time, call first. Victoria doesn't know about how things really were between us. I'd prefer to keep it that way." "How things really were?" I stared at him, seeing a stranger in the face I'd once loved. "What exactly have you told her about me?" "That our marriage ended. Amicably. That we grew apart. That you were struggling with some personal issues." He shrugged as if my entire existence was a minor inconvenience to be managed. "Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would upset her. Personal issues," I repeated, numbly. "The depression, Elena. The way you've been lately. Anyone can see you're not well." He glanced back toward the party, clearly eager to end this conversation. "Look, I've been more than generous. The house is paid for. Sarah's college fund is secure. You'll be fine." Before I could ask what he meant about the house being paid for, or how he could possibly think I was the one with mental health issues when he was the one living a double life, he was already walking away. I watched him return to Victoria's side, watched her smile up at him with the kind of adoration I remembered giving him once upon a time, back when I'd believed I was worthy of it. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage and a crushing sense of disorientation that made me feel like I was navigating through fog. Our house, the one we'd bought when Sarah was 5 and I'd still believed in forever, looked different somehow as I pulled into the driveway. Smaller, shabbier. I noticed the peeling paint on the shutters, the way the front garden had grown wild, because Michael had declared lawn care women's work when he'd grown too important for such things. Sarah's bedroom light was on, and I sat in my car for a long moment, trying to compose myself before facing her. How do you explain to your 16-year-old daughter that her father had just blown up your family at a cocktail party? How do you find the words to describe the kind of betrayal that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about your own life? I finally forced myself out of the car and into the house, calling out a greeting that I hoped sounded normal. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the oversized sweatshirt she'd claimed from my closet months ago. "Mom? You're home early. How was dinner with Jenny?" I'd told her I was meeting Jenny for dinner, which hadn't technically been a lie when I'd said it. I'd planned to confront Jenny about the invitation, to demand an explanation for why she'd thought I needed to see my husband announcing his engagement to someone else. It was illuminating, I said, hanging my purse on the hook by the door, with hands that still trembled slightly. "How was your evening? Get that history paper finished?" "Almost. Mom, are you okay? You look really pale." Sarah had always been perceptive, too smart for her own good and certainly too smart for me to hide much from her. She came down the stairs with the careful grace she'd inherited from my side of the family, before Michael's criticism had taught me to question every step I took. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." I managed what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "You should get some sleep. School tomorrow." She studied my face with the intensity she usually reserved for her AP chemistry homework. "Mom, something's wrong. Your mascara is smudged, and you only wear that dress for special occasions." "What happened?" I touched my cheek, feeling the evidence of tears I'd thought I'd wiped away. "Nothing for you to worry about. Just some adult stuff I need to figure out." Adult stuff like why Dad hasn't been home for dinner in 3 weeks? Adult stuff like why he's been getting mail sent to some other address. She crossed her arms, looking far too much like the lawyer she'd told me she wanted to become. "I'm not a little kid anymore, Mom. I can see that something's going on." The weight of the evening crashed over me all at once. The humiliation, the betrayal, the casual cruelty of Michael's words, and now the realization that Sarah had been watching our marriage dissolve from the front row. I sank into the worn armchair by the window, the one Michael had always complained was too shabby for the living room, but that I'd refused to replace because it had been my mother's. "Your father is getting remarried," I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. "I found out tonight, at their engagement party." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of fury that made her look startlingly adult. "He what? Mom, what are you talking about? You guys are married, to each other." "Apparently not anymore." I pulled my knees up to my chest, feeling smaller than I had since I was Sarah's age. "There's going to be a divorce. Your father has found someone else, someone better suited to the life he wants to live." "Better suited how?" Sarah's voice was sharp with indignation. "Mom, you're amazing. You work harder than anyone I know. You put him through business school. You raised me while he was building his company. You've supported everything he's ever wanted to do." Her fierce loyalty made my throat tight with emotion. "Your father sees things differently, sweetheart. He needs someone who fits better with his business associates, someone more polished." "You mean someone younger and prettier," Sarah said bluntly. "God, Mom, tell me you didn't just sit there and take this." I thought about the scene at the country club, about how quickly I'd shrunk under Michael's criticism, how completely I'd been unprepared for the public nature of my humiliation. I wasn't at my best tonight, I admitted. Sarah sat down on the arm of my chair, her hand warm on my shoulder. What's her name? Victoria. Victoria Sinclair. Sinclair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah frowned, her expression thoughtful. Wait, like Sinclair Development? The company that owns all those shopping centers? Her father owns half the commercial real estate in the city, according to your father. Oh my God. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. He's marrying her for her money. Mom, don't you see? This isn't about you not being good enough. This is about him being a gold digger. The bluntness of her assessment startled a laugh out of me, the first genuine emotion I'd felt since walking into that ballroom. Sarah, it's more complicated than that. Is it? Really? She turned to face me fully, her expression serious. Mom, I've been watching Dad for years. He's always been obsessed with status, with impressing people, with being seen as successful. Remember when he made you return that car because it wasn't the right brand? When he threw a fit because you wore jeans to the country club barbecue? I did remember, though I'd spent so many years making excuses for his behavior that I'd stopped seeing it clearly. He has high standards. He's insecure, Sarah corrected. And now he's found someone whose daddy's money can make him feel important. That has nothing to do with your worth as a person. Her words were like a cool cloth on a burn, soothing in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd accepted Michael's version of reality, the one where my failures as a wife had driven him away. Hearing Sarah's perspective, seeing the situation, through her clear eyes, made me wonder what else I'd been wrong about. There's something else, I said slowly, remembering Michael's comment about the house. He said the house was paid for. He made it sound like he was being generous, like he'd already taken care of everything. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? I don't know, but I think I need to find out. I stood up, feeling something shift. Inside me, a tiny spark of the woman I'd been before years of criticism had worn me down. I think there's a lot I need to find out. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research with the methodical determination I'd once applied to my college coursework. I'd been an accounting major before Sarah was born, before Michael had convinced me that my career was less important than supporting his. And those skills came back to me like muscle memory. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Our house, the one Michael claimed was paid for, was actually heavily mortgaged. Not just mortgaged, but refinanced multiple times over the past 3 years, each time pulling out more equity. According to the records I found through online searches, we owed more on the house than it was currently worth. The successful business Michael had been building, Patterson Solutions, was bleeding money. The client list I found through public filings showed a steady decline over the past 18 months. The fancy office downtown that I'd thought represented his success was actually 3 months behind on rent. But the most damaging discovery came when I started looking into Michael's personal finances. The man who'd criticized me for shopping at Target and buying generic groceries had been living a double life that was financed entirely by debt. Credit cards, personal loans, business loans that were personally guaranteed, a second mortgage, on our house that I'd never known about. My husband hadn't left me for a more suitable wife. He'd left me holding the bag for a financial disaster that was about to destroy everything we'd built together. I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m, surrounded by printouts and bank statements I'd requested, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd uncovered. The house Sarah and I lived in was going to be foreclosed on within months. The college fund Michael had mentioned was empty, cleaned out to pay for the lavish lifestyle he'd been maintaining to impress people like the Sinclairs. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it expecting to see something from Sarah or my sister. Instead, it was from Michael. Elena, we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow for lunch? There are some papers you need to sign regarding the house. Papers regarding the house. I stared at the message, understanding dawning with crystalline clarity. He wasn't just abandoning me for a younger woman. He was setting me up to take responsibility for his debts while he started fresh with his wealthy fiancée. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 days ago, the one who would have meekly signed whatever he put in front of her because she'd been trained to trust his judgment above her own. That woman was gone, burned away in the fire of public humiliation and private discovery. The woman who remained was someone I barely recognized, someone who'd been buried under years of small criticisms and subtle manipulations. But she was someone I thought I might actually like, given the chance to get to know her. I texted back, "Tomorrow at noon, Riverside Cafe." The same place where we'd had our first date 20 years ago, where he'd told me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, where he'd promised to love me forever, through better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. It seemed like an appropriate place to discuss how thoroughly he'd broken every single one of those vows. But as I finally headed upstairs to try to get some sleep, I wasn't thinking about confronting Michael about his lies. I wasn't planning to beg him to reconsider or to promise I'd try harder to meet his standards. Instead, I was thinking about Victoria Sinclair, about her perfect skin and designer clothes and daddy's money that made her such a suitable replacement for me. I was thinking about how much she probably didn't know about the man she was planning to marry. And I was thinking about foreclosure papers, and whether someone as polished and well-connected as Victoria would still want to be associated with a man whose financial house of cards was about to come crashing down around both our heads. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment for so long had lifted, replaced by a sharp focus that made everything seem possible. I'd spent 15 years seeing myself through Michael's eyes, accepting his assessment of my worth, my appearance, my potential. But sitting in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of his deception, I finally understood that his judgment had never been about me at all. It had been about control. I dressed carefully for our lunch meeting, choosing a navy blue dress I'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago but never worn because Michael had said it made me look like I was trying too hard. I styled my graying hair instead of hiding it under a ponytail, and I put on makeup with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to financial statements. Not because I wanted to impress him, but because I wanted to feel like myself again. The woman looking back at me from the bathroom mirror wasn't the defeated creature who'd fled the country club 3 nights ago. She had lines around her eyes, yes, but they were laugh lines and worry lines, and the kind of character that came from actually living life instead of posing for it. Her hands were strong from work, her shoulders straight from carrying burdens that had made her stronger instead of breaking her. Sarah knocked on my bedroom door as I was putting on earrings. "Mom, you look really nice. Like, really nice. Where are you going?" "To have lunch with your father." I turned to face her, seeing my own determination reflected in her eyes. "To discuss some paperwork about the house." "Paperwork?" She came into the room, her expression suspicious. "What kind of paperwork?" I'd debated how much to tell her about what I'd discovered. She was 16, brilliant, but still my child. The idea of burdening her with the knowledge that her father had essentially stolen her college fund and was preparing to leave us both holding the debt felt wrong. But she'd already seen too much of the truth to be satisfied with vague explanations. "It seems your father has been less than honest about our financial situation," I said carefully. "The house isn't paid for like he claimed. In fact, we're in danger of losing it." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions before settling on something that looked remarkably like the fierce protectiveness I usually felt toward her. "He's trying to stick you with his debts, isn't he? While he runs off with Princess, Daddy's money." "That appears to be the plan, yes." "What are you going to do?" I looked at my reflection one more time, straightening my shoulders and lifting my chin. "I'm going to have a conversation with your father about the consequences of underestimating people." The Riverside Cafe looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. All exposed brick and hanging plants and the kind of cozy atmosphere that had made it seem romantic when we were young and in love. Now it just felt like a museum exhibit of who we used to be, or who I thought we'd been. Michael was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a manila folder in front of him, and that patient expression he wore when he was about to explain something he thought was too complicated for me to understand. He stood when he saw me, and I caught the brief flash of surprise that crossed his face before he composed himself. "Elena, you look..." He paused, clearly recalibrating whatever he'd been about to say. "Different." "Thank you." I slid into the seat across from him, noticing how he'd chosen a table where his back was to the wall and he could see the entire restaurant, always positioning himself strategically, always maintaining control of the situation. I ordered. "You a salad?" he said, pushing a glass of water toward me. "The same thing you always get." The presumption rankled. The casual assumption that I was still the same woman who'd automatically ordered the cheapest item on the menu and eaten half of it while he told her about his day. "Actually, I think I'll have the salmon," I said, flagging down the waitress. "And a glass of the house Chardonnay." His eyebrows rose slightly. "It's barely noon, Elena." "It's been a very long few days," I replied smoothly. "I think I've earned it." We sat in awkward silence until the waitress had taken my order and refreshed his coffee. Then Michael opened the manila folder with the businesslike efficiency that had once impressed me, but now seemed like theater. "I know this is difficult," he began, his tone carefully modulated to convey both authority and compassion. "But we need to discuss the practical aspects of our separation." "Do we?" I leaned back in my chair, studying his face with new eyes. "Because I was under the impression that you'd already made all the practical decisions without consulting me." "Elena, please, let's not make this harder than it has to be." He pulled out a stack of papers, each page marked with yellow sticky notes indicating where I should sign. "These documents will transfer the house into your name entirely. No more shared responsibility. No more complications." "How generous of you." I accepted the papers but didn't look at them, keeping my eyes fixed on his face instead. "And what exactly am I taking responsibility for along with this house?" "Well, there are some outstanding obligations." He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the table. "Nothing you can't handle with your current income, especially once you're not supporting my business expenses anymore." "Outstanding obligations." I repeated his euphemism, slowly, tasting the words. "You mean the mortgage payments that are 3 months behind? The second mortgage I didn't know existed? Or are you referring to the home equity line of credit that's maxed out at $180,000? The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually be having a medical emergency. Where did you get that information?" "Public records, Michael. Amazing what you can find when you actually look." I finally glanced down at the papers in front of me, scanning the legal language that essentially transferred all liability for our debts to me while freeing him. To start fresh. "This is quite a document, very thorough. I especially appreciate the clause that releases you from any future financial responsibility for Sarah's education." "Elena, you don't understand the whole situation." His voice had taken on the edge it got when he was losing control of a conversation. "The business has had some temporary setbacks, but once I marry Victoria, there will be opportunities for investment, for expansion." "Ah, yes, Victoria." I set the papers aside and picked up my wine when it arrived, taking a slow sip while I watched him squirm. "Tell me, does your beautiful fiancé know about these temporary setbacks? Does she know that Patterson Solutions is hemorrhaging money? That you've been paying for your lavish courtship of her with borrowed money that you have no ability to repay?" "That's temporary," he said quickly, but sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the restaurant's air conditioning. Once the wedding, You'll have access to her father's money, and you can pay off all these debts without her ever knowing how close you came to bankruptcy." I nodded, as if I found this plan perfectly reasonable. "Very smart, Michael. Except for one small problem." "What problem?" I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face after so many years of careful neutrality. "The problem is that I'm not going to sign these papers." "Elena, be reasonable. You can't afford to fight this. You don't have money for lawyers. And I have connections." "You have debts," I corrected him. "Substantial debts that are about to become very public knowledge unless you find a way to pay them off quickly. And since you're asking me to assume responsibility for them, I think it's only fair that I understand exactly what I'd be taking on." I reached into my purse and pulled out my own folder, much thicker than his, filled with printouts and bank statements and loan documents I'd spent the past 3 days tracking down. His eyes widened as I spread them across the table like a hand of cards. "Let's see," I said, consulting the summary sheet I'd prepared. "The house. $347,000 in total debt against a current market value of maybe $280,000. Your business. $95,000 in unpaid invoices, $150,000 in equipment loans, and a commercial lease that's 3 months behind. Personal credit cards, $73,000 across 6 different accounts. And that's just what I found in one afternoon of searching." "How did you—" He reached for the papers, but I calmly moved them out of his reach. "I used to be an accountant, remember? Before you convinced me that my career was less important than supporting yours." I took another sip of wine, enjoying the way his complexion had shifted from pale to slightly green. I'm quite good with numbers when I put my mind to it. "Elena, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be." His voice had shifted from condescending to pleading. "These are just temporary cash flow issues. Once Victoria and I are married—" "Victoria," I said thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking about her a lot lately. She seems like such a lovely girl. So young, so trusting. I imagine she believes she's marrying a successful businessman, someone who can provide stability and security." "I am successful," he protested, but the words lacked conviction. "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're a man who's about to lose everything unless he can convince his ex-wife to shoulder his debts while he marries into money." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "What do you think Victoria's father would say if he knew the man courting his daughter was essentially bankrupt? What do you think the Sinclair family would think of their prospective son-in-law if they knew he was trying to defraud his ex-wife?" "It's not fraud," he said quickly. "It's a settlement agreement. Perfectly legal. Perfectly legal, perhaps, but not particularly honest. And honesty matters to people like the Sinclairs, doesn't it? People with reputations to protect? Social? Standing to maintain." I gathered my papers back into their folder, signaling that our business was concluded. People who wouldn't want to be associated with someone who abandons his family to avoid responsibility for his failures. "Elena, what do you want?" The question came out strangled, desperate. "What is this really about?" I stood up, leaving money on the table for my lunch and wine. "This is about consequences, Michael. For 15 years, you've made decisions based on what was best for you, regardless of how those decisions affected your family. You criticized me, undermined me, made me believe I was the problem in our marriage, all while you were living beyond your means and building a house of cards that was always going to fall down." "I never meant for things to get so complicated," he said, and for a moment I almost believed I heard genuine regret in his voice. "But they did get complicated. And now you want me to clean up your mess while you start over with someone else." I picked up my purse, looking down at this man I'd once loved, once trusted, once believed in completely. The difference is, I'm not the same woman who would have signed those papers without reading them. I'm not the woman who believed your lies about my worth, my appearance, my potential. "Then what do you propose we do?" he asked, his businessman's instincts kicking in even in defeat. "I propose you figure out how to pay your own debts," I said simply. "I propose you have an honest conversation with Victoria about your financial situation before you marry her under false pretenses. And I propose you remember that I'm Sarah's mother, not some obstacle to be disposed of when I become inconvenient." I was halfway to the door when he called after me. "Elena, wait. We can work something out. There has to be a solution that works for everyone." I turned back to look at him one last time. This man who'd shaped so much of my life, who'd made me question my worth for so long that I'd almost forgotten who I was underneath his criticism. "There is a solution, Michael. It's called facing the consequences of your actions like an adult." I smiled, the expression genuine this time. "I'm sure Victoria will be very understanding when you explain how you've been financing your relationship with borrowed money. After all, if she really loves you, money shouldn't matter, right?" The last thing I saw before walking out of the restaurant was Michael's face, pale and panicked, as he realized that his carefully constructed plan was crumbling around him. For the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: the satisfaction of standing up for myself. But as I drove home, I knew this was just the beginning. Michael wasn't going to simply accept defeat and walk away. He was going to fight, and he was going to use every weapon at his disposal to try to force me back into the role of compliant victim. What he didn't know was that I was done being a victim. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the past 3 days doing more than just researching our finances. I'd been making phone calls, sending emails, and preparing for the war he was about to declare. And what he definitely didn't know was that I had something he'd overlooked in his haste to escape responsibility: a complete record of every financial transaction he'd made over the past 3 years, including some very interesting payments, to a private investigator who'd been following me for months. Apparently, Michael had been planning this betrayal for much longer than I'd realized. He'd been building a case to paint me as an unfit mother, an unstable woman whose mental health problems justified his abandonment of our family. The only problem with his plan was that I'd found the evidence. And unlike him, I actually knew how to use it. The phone rang at 7:30 the next morning, jarring me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. Michael's name flashed on the screen and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. By the 4th call, I finally answered. "Elena, we need to talk immediately." His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize there may have been some misunderstandings." "Good morning to you too, Michael." I poured myself a cup of coffee, deliberately taking my time. "What kind of misunderstandings?" "The kind that could damage both of us if we're not careful." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him choosing his words. "Look, I know you're upset about Victoria, about the way you found out. I should have handled that better." Should have handled it better," I repeated, savoring the admission. "That's one way to put it." "Elena, please. Can we meet again today? There are things we need to discuss privately, away from lawyers and formal documents. Just the two of us. The way we used to solve problems." The way we used to solve problems. I almost laughed at the memory he was trying to invoke. In our marriage, problem-solving had meant me agreeing with whatever Michael decided was best, usually after he'd explained at length why my perspective was naive or misguided. "I'm afraid I'm rather busy today," I said, which was true. I had appointments with a divorce attorney, a financial advisor, and most importantly, a private investigator who specialized in uncovering hidden assets. Busy with what? The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended. "Elena, I hope you're not doing anything rash. Lawyers just complicate things unnecessarily." "Do they?" I find that interesting advice coming from someone who's been secretly consulting with legal counsel for months. I discovered the retainer payments to Morrison & Associates 3 days ago, part of Michael's careful preparation for what he'd planned to be my financial destruction. Silence stretched between us, broken only by what sounded like Michael dropping something heavy. How could you possibly know that? I know quite a few things now, Michael. For instance, I know that you've been having me followed by a private investigator named Derek Walsh. I know that you've been building a case to paint me as mentally unstable, probably to strengthen your position in custody negotiations. And I know that Mr. Walsh has some very interesting photographs and reports that I don't think Victoria would appreciate seeing. Elena, you don't understand what you're dealing with here. His voice had shifted from pleading to threatening. There are people involved in this situation who don't appreciate interference. Important people with significant resources. Are you threatening me? I asked, genuinely curious rather than frightened. The old Elena would have backed down immediately at the first hint of intimidation. This Elena found his desperation almost refreshing. I'm trying to protect you. Victoria's father isn't just wealthy. He's connected. He has influence in this city that goes far beyond real estate. If you push this too far, if you try to embarrass his family or interfere with his daughter's happiness, he has ways of making life very difficult for people. How interesting. I set down my coffee cup and walked to the window, looking out, at the garden I'd tended for over a decade while Michael was building his empire of debt and deception. It sounds like you're more afraid of the Sinclairs than you are of me. I'm not afraid of anyone, he said quickly. But the denial rang hollow. I'm being practical. Elena, sign the papers. Take the house. Start fresh. I'll even throw in an additional settlement, say $50,000 as a gesture of goodwill. $50,000. The amount was so absurdly small compared to the debts he wanted me to assume that I actually laughed out loud. Michael, do you realize how insulting that offer is? You want me to take on over $500,000 in debt in exchange for $50,000 in cash? Even if I were the financial illiterate you seem to think I am, that math doesn't work. It's not just about the money, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd learned to hate over the years. It's about being reasonable. It's about thinking of Sarah's future. Do you really want to drag her through a messy custody battle? Do you want her to see her parents destroying each other in court? The mention of Sarah made my blood run cold. Not because I was afraid of losing her, but because I recognized the manipulation tactic. Michael had always used our daughter as a weapon when he wanted me to comply with his demands. Speaking of Sarah, I said carefully, how exactly were you planning to explain your new marriage to her? Were you going to introduce Victoria as her stepmother before or after you told our daughter that you'd been lying to both of us for months? Sarah will adjust. Children are resilient, and she'll benefit from seeing what a successful marriage looks like. The casual dismissal of our daughter's feelings was like gasoline on a fire I hadn't realized was burning inside me. A successful marriage. Is that what you call a relationship built on financial deception and abandonment? Elena, you're being emotional again. This is exactly why we need to handle this quietly and quickly. You're not thinking clearly, and that's going to hurt everyone involved. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said, and meant it. Clear enough to know that I'm done with this conversation. Elena, wait. I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. Whatever Michael had planned to say next could wait. I had more important things to do than listen to him try to manipulate me back into submission. The law office of Patricia Chen was located in a converted Victorian house near downtown, the kind of place that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Patricia herself was a small woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been recommended by my sister, who'd used her services during her own divorce 3 years earlier. Mrs. Torres, she said, rising from behind a desk that looked like it had survived several decades of family law battles. Rebecca spoke very highly of you. Please, have a seat and tell me how I can help. I'd brought copies of everything I'd discovered about Michael's financial situation, and I spread the documents across her conference table with the methodical precision I'd once applied to quarterly reports. "I need to understand my options," I began, then told her the entire story. The engagement party, the debts, Michael's attempt to transfer liability to me, and most importantly, the evidence I'd found of his surveillance and character assassination campaign. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mrs. Torres, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your husband has put together a sophisticated plan to escape his financial obligations while positioning himself advantageously for custody negotiations. The private investigator, the psychiatric evaluation he's been planning to request, the careful documentation of your supposed instability. This is not amateur hour. So you think I should just sign his papers and accept defeat?" I asked, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "On the contrary, I think your husband has made several critical errors, the biggest of which is underestimating his opponent." She pulled out a fresh legal pad and uncapped an expensive-looking pen. "Tell me, what do you know about marital property laws in this state?" For the next hour, Patricia walked me through the complex web of legal protections I hadn't known existed. In our state, all debts incurred during marriage were considered marital obligations, regardless of whose name was on the loan documents. Michael couldn't simply transfer his business debts to me without a court order, and he certainly couldn't do so without full financial disclosure. "More importantly," she continued, "the evidence you've uncovered suggests possible fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. If your husband has been hiding assets or income while accumulating debt, that changes everything." "What kind of changes?" I asked, though the gleam in her eyes suggested I was going to like the answer. "The kind that could result in him being responsible for your legal fees, for starters. The kind that could lead to criminal charges if we can prove intentional deception. And most importantly, for your immediate situation, the kind that could lead to a court freezing all marital assets until a full forensic accounting can be completed." I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "You mean he wouldn't be able to marry Victoria until this is resolved?" "If there are ongoing legal proceedings regarding marital assets, any new marriage could be considered an attempt to shield resources from creditors. A family court judge would take a very dim view of such behavior." Patricia smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Mrs. Torres, your husband may think he's playing chess, but he's forgotten that his opponent knows the rules too." We spent another hour planning strategy. Patricia would file for an immediate asset freeze while requesting full financial discovery. She'd also petition the court to require psychological evaluations for both parents, since Michael had been planning to question my mental fitness. "There's one more thing," I said as we wrapped up our meeting. "The private investigator my husband hired. Is there any way to find out what kind of information he's been gathering?" "Actually, yes. Private investigators are required to maintain detailed records of their activities, especially when those activities involve surveillance of private citizens. We can subpoena those records as part of the discovery process." Patricia made another note. "Mrs. Torres, is there anything in your background that your husband might try to use against you? Any substance abuse, financial irregularities, anything that could be twisted to suggest instability?" I thought about the question seriously. Over the past few years, I'd certainly had periods of sadness, times when Michael's constant criticism had left me feeling lost and uncertain. I'd gained weight, neglected my appearance, sometimes stayed in bed longer than I should have on weekends. But I'd never missed work, never neglected Sarah, never done anything that could reasonably be called irresponsible. "Nothing significant," I said finally, though I'm sure he could make my depression sound worse than it was if he wanted to. "Depression that coincided with his emotional abuse and financial deception," Patricia noted. "Any competent psychologist would identify that as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. not evidence of mental instability. As I left Patricia's office, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since that humiliating night at the country club, I felt like I had allies, like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. My next stop was the office of Robert Kim, a financial advisor who specialized in divorce planning. Rebecca had recommended him as well, describing him as someone who could make sense of even the most complicated financial situations. Robert turned out to be a methodical man in his early 40s who treated financial analysis like detective work. He spent nearly 2 hours going through Michael's business records, asking detailed questions about our lifestyle, our spending patterns, and the timeline of various major purchases. "This is fascinating," he said finally, leaning back from his computer screen where he'd been entering data. "Mrs. Torres, your husband's spending patterns over the past 3 years show classic signs of someone preparing for a major life change." "What do you mean?" "Look at this." He turned his monitor so I could see the spreadsheet he'd created. 18 months ago, his business income started declining, but his personal spending increased dramatically. New car lease, country club, membership, expensive dinners, luxury travel. All things that would be necessary to court someone from Victoria Sinclair's social circle. So he's been planning this for over a year," I said, though it wasn't really a question. "Planning and financing it by systematically depleting your marital assets." Robert highlighted several entries on his spreadsheet. "This pattern suggests..." He knew his business was failing, but chose to maintain an expensive lifestyle rather than address the underlying problems. "Can you prove that in court?" "Absolutely. This kind of financial behavior leaves a very clear paper trail. More importantly, I can show that his current debt situation makes him essentially judgment-proof. Even if you were awarded a significant settlement, he has no assets to satisfy it." "But Victoria's family does," I said, understanding dawning. "Exactly. Which means your husband's financial recovery depends entirely on his marriage to Ms. Sinclair proceeding as planned. Any delay or complication could leave him facing bankruptcy." Robert walked me through several different scenarios, showing me how the asset freeze Patricia planned to request would effectively trap Michael in his current situation. Without access to his remaining credit lines, he wouldn't be able to maintain the lifestyle necessary to keep Victoria interested. Without the ability to pay his mounting debts, he'd face increasing pressure from creditors. "Mrs. Torres, I want to be clear about something," Robert said as we concluded our meeting. "This isn't about revenge or punishment. This is about protecting your legitimate interests and ensuring your husband faces the consequences of his financial decisions." "What's the difference?" I asked. "Revenge is emotional and often self-destructive. Protecting your interests is strategic and legally sound. The first makes you look vindictive. The second makes you look like a competent woman who refuses to be taken advantage of." My final appointment of the day was with Helen Murphy, the private investigator Patricia had recommended. Helen's office was sparse and professional, dominated by filing cabinets and computer equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd expected. "Patricia filled me in on the basics," Helen said without preamble. "Your husband hired Derek Walsh to build a case against you. I know Derek's work, and I know his methods. He's thorough, but not particularly creative." "What does that mean for me?" "It means he's probably focused on gathering evidence of behavior that could be interpreted as unstable or irresponsible. Late-night grocery runs, visits to bars or liquor stores, meetings with male friends, anything that could be spun to suggest poor judgment or moral failings." I thought about my activities over the past few months, trying to remember anything that could be misinterpreted. I don't go to bars. I barely drink except for the occasional glass of wine with dinner, and I certainly haven't been meeting with any men. That's what I expected. Derek's problem is that he's probably been following a woman who works 2 jobs, takes care of her daughter, and has been faithfully maintaining a household while her husband destroys their finances. Helen smiled grimly. Not exactly the profile of someone who's mentally unstable or morally compromised. So, what has he been reporting? That's what I'm going to find out. Derek has some habits that work in our favor. He's meticulous about documentation, which means he has detailed logs of everywhere you've been and everything you've done. He's also not particularly tech-savvy, which means those logs are probably stored in ways that make them accessible to someone with the right skills. Helen explained that her investigation would focus on 2 areas. First, documenting Derek's surveillance activities to show the extent of Michael's planning, and second, uncovering any additional information about Michael's financial situation that might not be reflected in public records. Mrs. Torres, there's something else you should know. Derek Walsh has a reputation for being willing to embellish his findings when the client is paying well enough. If your husband has been pressuring him to find evidence of instability, he might have been creative with his interpretations. You mean he might have lied in his reports? I mean he might have characterized innocent behavior in ways that support your husband's narrative. A trip to the grocery store at 9 p.m. becomes subject exhibiting erratic behavior and poor judgment. A conversation with a male neighbor becomes subject engaging in inappropriate relationships. The idea that someone had been watching, me, judging my every action and twisting innocent activities into evidence of moral failing, made me feel sick. But it also made me angry in a way I hadn't experienced before. A cold fury that sharpened my focus rather than clouding it. How long will your investigation take? I asked. Give me a week, maybe 2 if Derek's security is better than I expect. Helen leaned forward, her expression serious. Mrs. Torres, I need you to understand something. Once we start this process, your husband is going to realize he's under investigation. He's going to escalate his efforts to pressure you into signing those papers. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the question, really considered what it would mean to continue down this path. Michael would be furious when he realized his plan was falling apart. He'd use every weapon at his disposal to try to force me back into compliance. He'd probably involve Victoria's family, try to turn Sarah against me, maybe even attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent. But the alternative was to accept his version of reality, to sign away my rights and take responsibility for his failures while he started fresh with someone else's money. The alternative was to teach my daughter that women should accept whatever treatment they're given, that standing up for yourself was too risky to attempt. I'm prepared, I said, and meant it. That evening, I sat Sarah down for the most difficult conversation of our relationship. I told her about the divorce proceedings, about the financial situation, and about the fact that her father had been having me followed by a private investigator. "Mom, that's insane," she said, her face cycling through disbelief and anger. "He hired someone to spy on you? What did he think he was going to find?" "Evidence that I'm an unfit mother, apparently. Something he could use to justify taking custody away from me." Sarah's expression hardened in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Michael at his worst. "Over my dead body. Mom, I'm 16. I get to choose where I live, and I choose to live with you." "Sweetheart, it might not be that simple. Your father has resources, connections. He's going to fight this with everything he has. Then we'll fight back with everything we have." She reached across the kitchen table and took my hands in hers. "Mom, for the first time in my life, I'm seeing you actually stand up for yourself. I'm seeing the woman you were before Dad spent years tearing you down. I'm not going to let him win now." Her fierce loyalty brought tears to my eyes, but they were good tears. Cleansing tears that washed away the last remnants of doubt about the path I'd chosen. "There's something else," I said. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Your father is going to try everything he can think of to pressure me into backing down. He might try to turn you against me, or convince you that I'm being unreasonable. Mom, I've been watching this marriage for 16 years. I've seen how he treats you, how he makes you feel small and worthless. I've seen how much happier you are when he's not around. I care about Michael, but I can't marry someone who's been lying to me about something this fundamental. And I certainly can't be part of something that would hurt you and your daughter." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two women who had more in common than either of us had expected. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "Mrs. Torres, can I ask you something personal?" "Elena, and yes, you can ask. Was he always like this? The lying? The manipulation? The way he talks about you now?" I thought about the question, really considered it. Had Michael always been capable of this level of deception, or had it developed over time as his business failed and his desperation grew? "He was always ambitious," I said finally. "Always concerned about status and appearance. But the cruelty, the systematic lying, that's newer. Or maybe I just didn't see it clearly before." "He talks about you like you're nothing," Victoria said quietly. "Like you're an obstacle to be managed rather than a person who shared 15 years of his life. It's disturbing." "It is disturbing. And it should tell you everything you need to know about what kind of husband he'd be if you went through with this marriage." Victoria nodded slowly, as if she'd been thinking the same thing. "Mrs. Torres, Elena, there's something else. You should know. Michael has been pressuring me to move up our wedding date. He wants to get married next month instead of waiting until spring." "Any idea why?" "I think he's hoping that once we're married, my father will help him with his financial problems. Daddy's made some comments about helping Michael expand his business, maybe investing in some new ventures." Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "What Daddy doesn't know is that he'd essentially be paying off Michael's existing debts rather than funding actual growth." "Have you told your father what you've learned?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to understand the full situation." Victoria hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Elena, I know this is an impossible thing to ask, but is there any way we could work together on this? Any way we could make sure Michael faces consequences for what he's done without destroying everyone in the process?" The request surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. Victoria was as much a victim of Michael's deception as I was, just in a different way. She'd been lied to, manipulated, and used as an unwitting weapon in his campaign to escape responsibility for his failures. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "I don't know exactly, but Michael's been playing us against each other when we should be working together. He's counting on you being too hurt and angry to think clearly, and he's counting on me being too naive to ask the right questions. And now I think we should show him what happens when his victims compare notes," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength. "Elena, you have every right to hate me. I'm the woman your husband chose to replace you, but I didn't choose to be part of his deception, and I don't want to profit from your suffering." I studied this young woman who had inadvertently become the catalyst for the destruction of my marriage. She was privileged, certainly, and naive about the realities of financial struggle. But she was also sitting here apologizing for wrongs. She hadn't knowingly committed offering to work with the woman she'd supposedly replaced. "Victoria, if we do this, if we work together, Michael is going to be furious. He's going to try to turn us against each other again, and he's going to use every weapon he has to discredit both of us. Let him try," she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw steel beneath the fragile exterior. I've spent my whole life being protected from unpleasant realities. Maybe it's time I learned how to fight back. We spent the next hour planning what Victoria called our alliance of the deceived. She would continue her engagement to Michael, while secretly working with my legal team to document his lies and financial deceptions. Her father's investigators would share their findings with my attorneys, and she would record any conversations where Michael admitted to his plans for sticking me with his debts. "There's one more thing," Victoria said as we prepared to leave. "Michael doesn't know I'm aware of his surveillance of you. He's been showing me some of the reports, trying to convince me that you're unstable and potentially dangerous to your daughter. What kind of reports? Pictures of you looking tired or upset, taken out of context to suggest emotional instability. Records of your activities twisted to sound suspicious. He's been building a narrative that you're an unfit mother who can't be trusted with important decisions. The violation felt even more profound knowing that Michael had been sharing these twisted interpretations of my life with his fiancée, using them to justify his betrayal and convince Victoria that I deserved what was happening to me. He's planning to use this information in court? I asked. That was the plan. But Elena, some of these reports are obviously fabricated. Derek Walsh has been billing Michael for surveillance on days when I know you were at work, and he's claiming to have photographed you in places that don't match your actual activities. This was the evidence I needed to prove that Michael's case against me was built on lies and manufactured evidence. With Victoria's testimony and the documentation she could provide, Patricia would be able to show that Michael had orchestrated an elaborate fraud designed to steal my assets and my daughter. "Why are you helping me?" I asked as we stood to leave. "You could just walk away from Michael, find someone else, pretend this never happened." Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because walking away wouldn't undo the damage he's already done to you, and because I want him to face consequences for treating people like expendable resources." She paused, then added softly, "And because I think my father needs to understand what kind of man almost became his son-in-law." As I drove home, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken in just 1 week. I'd gone from being a discarded wife to being the architect of my own defense. I'd assembled a team of professionals who believed in my case, and a daughter who stood firmly in my corner. And now I had an unlikely ally in the woman who was supposed to replace me. Michael had made a critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that his victims would remain isolated, that Victoria and I would never compare notes or work together. He'd counted on his ability to control the narrative, to keep everyone operating with incomplete information while he maneuvered for maximum advantage. What he hadn't anticipated was that lies have a way of catching up with liars, especially when their victims start talking to each other. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Asset freeze approved. Court date moved up to Monday. Michael's attorney has requested an emergency meeting. This is happening faster than expected." I smiled as I pulled into my driveway, looking up at the house that Michael had tried to turn into my financial prison. In 3 days, a judge would hear the evidence of his deception and decide whether his plan to escape responsibility would succeed. But Michael didn't know about Victoria's change of heart, or about the evidence she was prepared to provide, or about the alliance we'd formed to ensure that his victims finally had a voice in the proceedings. Monday was going to be a very interesting day. The courthouse steps felt like theater before a performance as I climbed them Monday morning, my heels clicking against the concrete with a confidence I'd spent the weekend practicing. Patricia walked beside me, her briefcase heavy with evidence we'd compiled, while Victoria lingered near the parking structure, waiting for her cue to enter our carefully orchestrated drama. Michael was already inside with his attorney, Richard Morrison, a silver-haired man whose reputation for winning ugly divorces had cost my husband a retainer he couldn't afford. I'd learned from Robert's financial analysis that Michael had borrowed against his life insurance policy to pay Morrison's fees, a desperate move that spoke volumes about how much this case meant to him. "Remember," Patricia murmured as we approached, "the metal detectors. Let Morrison do the talking for his side. Michael's going to want to interrupt, to control the narrative, but the more he speaks, the more rope he gives us to hang him with." Inside the courtroom, I felt the weight of my decision to fight back settling around me like armor. Judge Catherine Walsh presided from the bench, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s whose reputation for cutting through legal theatrics was exactly what Patricia had hoped for when she'd requested this particular courtroom. Michael sat at the defendant's table, and I was struck by how different he looked from the confident man who'd humiliated me at the country club just 10 days ago. His expensive suit couldn't hide the strain around his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted with his pen, the occasional glances he shot toward the gallery as if expecting someone to rescue him from this predicament. Morrison stood first, his voice smooth and practiced as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of asset division in an amicable divorce. Mrs. Torres has been offered extremely generous terms that would leave her with full ownership of the marital home and substantial financial security. Her refusal to accept these terms and her request for an asset freeze appears to be motivated by emotion rather than reason." "Your Honor," Patricia rose, her voice cutting through Morrison's polished rhetoric like a blade, "what Mr. Morrison describes as generous terms would actually require my client to assume over $500,000 in debt while her estranged husband walks away free and clear to marry into significant wealth. This is not generosity. This is fraud." Judge Walsh leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "That's a serious accusation, Counselor. I assume you have evidence to support it?" "We do, Your Honor. Extensive evidence." Patricia opened her briefcase and began laying out documents with the precision of a surgeon. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Torres has systematically depleted marital assets while hiding the true extent of his business losses. He has borrowed against the family home without his wife's knowledge, maxed out credit lines in both their names, and used marital funds to finance an elaborate courtship of another woman. Morrison jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These allegations are inflammatory and unsupported by... They're supported by bank records, loan documents, and credit card statements," Patricia continued smoothly, handing copies to the court clerk. "More disturbing still, Mr. Torres has been conducting a surveillance and character assassination campaign against his wife for the past 6 months, presumably to strengthen his position in custody negotiations." I watched Michael's face as Patricia spoke, saw the moment when he realized how much we'd uncovered. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Michael wasn't listening. His attention was fixed on the courtroom doors, where Victoria had just entered and taken a seat in the back row. Judge Walsh spent several minutes reviewing the financial documents Patricia had provided, her expression growing more severe with each page. "Mr. Morrison, these records appear to show that your client has been less than forthcoming about his financial situation. Care to explain?" Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, my client's business has experienced some temporary setbacks, but..." "Temporary setbacks?" Patricia interrupted. "Your Honor, Patterson Solutions has been insolvent for over 18 months. Mr. Torres has been paying operating expenses with personal credit cards and using advances from one loan to make payments on others. This isn't a business downturn. This is a Ponzi scheme with his own family as the victims." Michael finally exploded, exactly as Patricia had predicted he would. "That's a lie." He shot to his feet, ignoring Morrison's attempts to restrain him. "I've worked for 15 years to build that business, to provide for my family. Elena doesn't understand the first thing about running a company or managing complex financial..." "Mr. Torres," Judge Walsh's voice cut through his outburst like ice water, "sit down and let your attorney speak for you." But Michael was beyond listening to advice. The careful facade he'd maintained for months was crumbling, revealing the desperate man underneath. "Your Honor, my wife has been struggling with mental health issues for years. She's depressed, unstable. Sometimes she doesn't get out of bed for days. I've been trying to protect her from the stress of our financial difficulties, trying to handle everything myself so she wouldn't have to..." "By having her followed by a private investigator?" Patricia interjected smoothly. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Mr. Torres hired Derek Walsh to conduct surveillance of his wife over a 6-month period. Mr. Walsh's reports, which we've obtained through legal discovery, show a pattern of misrepresentation and outright fabrication designed to paint Mrs. Torres as mentally unstable." Judge Walsh turned her attention to Morrison, who was frantically shuffling through papers. "Counselor, were you aware of this surveillance activity?" Your Honor, my client was concerned about his wife's emotional state and the potential impact on their minor child. Any investigation was conducted within legal bounds and for legitimate purposes. Legitimate purposes, Patricia repeated, such as photographing Mrs. Torres at her workplace and characterizing her dedicated work ethic as compulsive behavior indicating possible mental instability, or following her to grocery stores and describing her careful budgeting as erratic, purchasing patterns suggesting financial irresponsibility. I watched Michael's face drain of color as Patricia methodically destroyed his character assassination campaign. But the real blow came when she played her trump card. Your Honor, we also have testimony from an unexpected witness regarding Mr. Torres's true motivations and the extent of his deception. Patricia gestured toward the gallery. Ms. Victoria Sinclair, Mr. Torres's fiancée, has some disturbing information about his plans for this divorce settlement. The gasp that escaped Michael was audible throughout the courtroom. Victoria rose gracefully from her seat and walked to the witness stand, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with the sound of his world collapsing. Ms. Sinclair? Patricia began once Victoria had been sworn in. How long have you been engaged to Mr. Torres? Approximately 3 months, Victoria replied, her voice steadied despite the tension radiating from the defendant's table. And what did Mr. Torres tell you about his marriage to Mrs. Torres? He told me they had been separated for over a year, that Elena was struggling with addiction and mental health issues, and that she had agreed to an amicable divorce because she recognized she needed help. Did you believe these statements? I had no reason not to. Michael was very convincing, very concerned about Elena's welfare. He made it sound like he was trying to protect her from the stress of a public divorce. Patricia paced slowly in front of the witness stand, building toward her climax. Ms. Sinclair, when did you first learn that Mr. Torres had been lying to you about his marriage? Last week, when my father's investigators uncovered discrepancies in Michael's financial statements. That led me to investigate further, and I discovered that Elena and Michael were still living together as recently as 2 months ago, that there had been no separation, and that Elena knew nothing about our engagement until she accidentally discovered it at our engagement party. Morrison objected strenuously, but Judge Walsh overruled him, clearly fascinated by this unexpected turn in the proceedings. Ms. Sinclair, did Mr. Torres discuss his financial situation with you? He told me the house was paid off and that Elena would be financially secure after the divorce. He said his business was thriving and that he was excited about the expansion. Opportunities my family connections might provide. Did you subsequently learn that these statements were false? Completely false. Michael's business is bankrupt, the house is heavily mortgaged, and Elena was being asked to assume responsibility for debts she didn't even know existed. Patricia paused dramatically. Ms. Sinclair, based on what you've learned about Mr. Torres's deceptions, do you still intend to marry him? Victoria's answer rang through the courtroom with crystal clarity. Absolutely not. I cannot marry someone who has lied to me about every fundamental aspect of his life, and I certainly cannot be party to the financial destruction of his family. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael sat frozen at his table, his carefully constructed plan exploding around him like a controlled demolition. Morrison whispered frantically in his ear, but Michael wasn't listening. His attention was fixed on Victoria with a mixture of disbelief and rage that transformed his features into something almost unrecognizable. Judge Walsh called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Michael finally found his voice. Victoria, what the hell do you think you're doing? His words carried across the nearly empty room as he approached her near the witness stand. I'm telling the truth, she replied calmly, though I could see her hands trembling slightly. Something you apparently forgot how to do months ago. You can't just walk away from this, Michael hissed, his voice low and threatening. Your father has already committed to investments in my business. There are contracts, agreements. There are no contracts, Victoria said firmly. Daddy may have discussed possibilities, but nothing was ever formalized. And now that he knows the truth about your financial situation, I can guarantee there never will be. I watched this exchange from across the courtroom, fascinated by the transformation in both of them. Victoria had shed the fragile uncertainty I'd seen in the park, revealing a steel core that her privileged upbringing had hidden but not eliminated. Michael, meanwhile, was showing his true colors at last, the mask of charming businessman finally stripped away to reveal the desperate predator underneath. Victoria, you don't understand what you're doing. Michael's voice took on the wheedling tone he'd once used with me when he wanted something. Elena has poisoned you against me. She's manipulative, vindictive. She's using you to get revenge because she can't accept that our marriage is over. Our marriage was over the moment you started lying to me about everything that mattered, Victoria replied. Elena didn't poison me against you, Michael. You did that all by yourself. When court reconvened, Judge Walsh wasted no time in delivering her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, I'm granting Mrs. Torres's motion for an asset freeze pending a complete forensic accounting of all marital property and debts. I'm also ordering psychological evaluations for both parties, as Mr. Torres has raised questions about his wife's mental fitness. Morrison tried to object, but Judge Walsh silenced him with a look. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation. The evidence suggests possible fraud, identity theft, and financial elder abuse if Mr. Torres has been manipulating vulnerable clients through his business. Michael's face had gone completely white. Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Mr. Torres, was your belief that you could manipulate the legal system the same way you've apparently been manipulating everyone else in your life. Judge Walsh's voice carried the weight of 30 years of family law experience. Court is adjourned. Mr. Torres, I strongly suggest you retain different counsel because your current attorney has been working with incomplete and misleading information. As the courtroom emptied, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The satisfaction was obvious. Michael's plan had been exposed and defeated, his lies unraveled in public, his future with Victoria destroyed by his own greed and deception. But the sadness was there too, mourning for the man I'd once loved who had chosen this path of destruction rather than facing his failures honestly. Patricia packed her briefcase with the efficient movements of someone who had just won a significant victory. Elena, this is just the beginning. The asset freeze gives us time to conduct a proper investigation, but Michael isn't going to give up easily. He's going to try to find another way to escape responsibility. What can he do now? Victoria's testimony destroyed his credibility, and the financial evidence speaks for itself. Desperate men do desperate things, Patricia warned. He's facing potential criminal charges, bankruptcy, and complete social disgrace. That makes him dangerous in ways we need to be prepared for. As if summoned by her words, Michael appeared beside our table. Morrison had apparently abandoned him, and he stood alone, his expensive suit rumpled and his face haggard. Elena, he said, his voice barely controlled. This doesn't have to end this way. We can still work something out, still find a solution that protects everyone. I think the time for working things out has passed, I replied, surprised by how calm I felt facing him. You made your choice, Michael. You chose deception over honesty, greed over responsibility, and cruelty over compassion. These are the consequences. Consequences? His laugh was bitter and sharp. Elena, you have no idea what consequences look like. You think you've won something here today, but all you've done is guarantee that Sarah gets to watch her parents destroy each other in public. Sarah gets to watch her mother stand up for herself and refuse to be victimized, I corrected. That's a lesson worth learning. Michael's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw something that chilled me. It wasn't anger or frustration or even fear. It was calculation, the look of someone planning his next move. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, then walked away without another word. Victoria approached cautiously, waiting until Michael had left the courtroom before speaking. "Elena, I know this was difficult, but I'm glad I could help set the record straight." "Thank you," I said, meaning it completely. I know testifying against Michael couldn't have been easy. Actually, it was easier than I expected. Once I started telling the truth, really telling it, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying around his lies without realizing how heavy they were. Patricia gathered the last of her papers and stood to leave. "Ladies, I hate to break up this mutual admiration society, but we need to discuss next steps. Elena, the forensic accounting will take several weeks, and Michael's attorney will probably file appeals and motions to delay everything as long as possible." "What about the criminal investigation?" I asked. "That depends on what the district attorney's office finds when they start digging. If Michael has been defrauding clients through his business, this could become much bigger than a divorce case." As we walked out of the courthouse together, I felt the weight of public attention for the first time. Word had apparently spread about the dramatic testimony and surprise witness, and several reporters waited on the steps with cameras and questions. "Mrs. Torres, how does it feel to have your husband's fiancé testify on your behalf?" Sarah's voice was steady and mature beyond her years. "Whatever he's planning, I'm on your side." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the events of the day, about the team I'd assembled, and the strategy we'd developed. For the first time, since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some control over my situation. Not complete control, not yet, but enough to believe that I wasn't helpless. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, I thought it might be another attempt by Michael to pressure me into submission. Instead, the message was brief and unexpected. "Mrs. Torres, this is Victoria Sinclair. I think we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow afternoon? I have some questions about Michael that I hope you can answer." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to process what it meant. Why would Victoria want to talk to me? What questions could she possibly have that Michael hadn't already answered? And most importantly, was this another one of Michael's manipulations, or was his perfect fiancé starting to have doubts about the man she was planning to marry? I texted back, "Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Riverside Park near the Rose Garden." Her response came immediately. "Thank you. And Mrs. Torres, please come alone." As I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself wondering what Victoria Sinclair had discovered about her fiancé, and whether the conversation we were about to have would change everything once again. The next morning brought 2 phone calls that confirmed my suspicions about Michael's escalating desperation. The first was from Sarah's school, informing me that Michael had contacted them to request copies of her academic records and counseling notes, claiming he was concerned about her emotional stability in light of our difficult divorce. The second call was from my supervisor at the insurance company, letting me know that Michael had contacted our HR department to inquire about my work performance and whether there had been any concerns about my mental health or reliability. "Elena, I told him that your personal life is none of our business and that your work performance has been exemplary," my boss assured me. "But I thought you should know he's making inquiries." "Thank you for telling me," I said, though I wasn't surprised. Michael was clearly trying to build a comprehensive case that I was unstable and unreliable, a woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted with important decisions like financial planning or child custody. What he didn't realize was that each of these inquiries created a paper trail that Patricia could use to document his harassment campaign. Every call he made, every question he asked, every attempt to undermine my reputation was evidence of his systematic effort to destroy my credibility. I spent the morning returning calls from the various professionals I'd hired, coordinating their efforts and making sure everyone understood the timeline. Patricia had already filed the motion for an asset freeze, and the court date was scheduled for the following week. Robert was preparing a detailed financial analysis that would show the true extent of Michael's debt and deception. Helen had made contact with Derek Walsh's former assistant, who apparently had some interesting stories to tell about her old boss's methods. At 1:30, I drove to Riverside Park, arriving early so I could choose a location that felt safe and public. The Rose Garden was at the center of the park, surrounded by walking paths and usually busy with joggers and families. I chose a bench with clear sightlines in all directions and waited. Victoria Sinclair arrived precisely at 2:00, and seeing her in daylight, without the glamour of the country club setting, I was struck by how young she looked. She was beautiful, certainly, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from good genetics and expensive maintenance. But there was something fragile about her, too, a brittleness that suggested the perfection might be more carefully constructed than it appeared. She sat down on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining a careful distance between us. "Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," I replied honestly. "Victoria, if this is some kind of attempt by Michael to—" "It's not." She cut me off, then immediately looked embarrassed by her abruptness. "I'm sorry. This is very difficult for me." "What's difficult?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, I was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "Michael has been lying to me," she said simply. "About you, about your marriage, about his business, about everything." "What do you mean?" "He told me you were separated, that you'd been living apart for months because of your problems. He said you'd agreed to an amicable divorce and that you were actually happy he'd found someone new." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said you were struggling with depression and substance abuse, that you'd become someone he didn't recognize." I felt a familiar anger rising, the same cold fury that had sustained me through the past week. "And you believed him?" "Why wouldn't I? He was so convincing, so concerned about you and your daughter. He made it sound like he was trying to protect both of you from the stress of a public divorce." Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Mrs. Torres, I'm not a bad person. I would never have gotten involved with a married man if I'd known the truth." "What made you realize he was lying?" "Several things. Little inconsistencies in his stories that started to add up. But mostly, it was my father." Victoria turned, to face me fully for the first time since sitting down. "Daddy always investigates anyone I'm serious about. It's embarrassing, but it's also protective. When he started looking into Michael's background, he found discrepancies." "What?" "Kind of discrepancies, financial ones mainly. Michael's business isn't the success story he's been telling me. His debts are enormous, much larger than he's admitted. And the way he's been paying for our relationship." Victoria's voice trailed off as she struggled to find the words. "He's been using borrowed money," I said, understanding. "Money he doesn't have and can't repay. Money that legally belongs to you and your daughter," Victoria corrected. "Mrs. Torres, I had no idea. When Michael talked about the house being paid off, about your financial security being assured, I thought he was being generous. I didn't realize he was trying to stick you with debts he'd accumulated while courting me." The admission hung between us like a confession. Victoria Sinclair, the perfect woman Michael had chosen to replace me, was sitting in a public park, apologizing for unknowingly participating in my financial destruction. "What are you going to do with this information?" I asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. One called out, "Ms. Sinclair, are you planning to sue Mr. Torres for fraud?" shouted another. Patricia stepped smoothly between us and the reporters. "My client has no comment at this time, but we're confident that justice will be served as this matter proceeds through the courts." Victoria handled the attention with the grace of someone who'd grown up in the public eye. I simply told the truth about what I knew. That's what any honest person would do in this situation. As we reached our cars, Victoria pulled me aside. "Elena, there's something else you should know. My father wants to meet with you." "Why?" "Because he's furious about Michael's attempts to defraud our family, and because he thinks you might be interested in a business proposition." I stared at her, not sure I'd heard correctly. "What kind of business proposition?" "Daddy's been looking for someone to manage the financial services division of his company. Someone with integrity. Someone who understands what it's like to be taken advantage of by unscrupulous advisors." Victoria smiled. "Someone exactly like you." The offer was so unexpected, so completely different from anything I'd imagined, that I couldn't immediately process it. "Victoria, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure I'm qualified." "You just outmaneuvered one of the most cunning men I've ever met using nothing but research skills and determination. You uncovered a complex fraud scheme and assembled the evidence needed to prove it in court. If that doesn't qualify you to help other people protect their assets, I don't know what does." As I drove home, my mind raced with the implications of everything that had happened. Michael's plan had been completely destroyed, his lies exposed, his future with Victoria eliminated. The asset freeze meant he couldn't access any more of our joint resources, and the criminal investigation meant he could face serious legal consequences for his deceptions. But Patricia's warning echoed in my mind. Desperate men do desperate things. Michael wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and he still had weapons he could deploy. He could try to turn Sarah against me, could attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent, could even become physically dangerous if he felt sufficiently cornered. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, I saw the news coverage online. You were amazing. Dad's been calling me all afternoon, but I'm not answering. Love you." The support from my daughter was exactly what I needed to hear. Whatever Michael tried next, whatever desperate measures he resorted to, Sarah and I would face them together. I wasn't the isolated, vulnerable woman he'd been counting on manipulating into submission. When I arrived home, I found Derek Walsh sitting in his car across the street from my house. He made no attempt to hide his presence, and when I waved at him, he actually waved back. The absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh. Michael's surveillance campaign had been so thoroughly exposed in court that Walsh apparently saw no point in pretending anymore. I called Patricia immediately. "Derek Walsh is parked outside my house. Should I be concerned?" "Actually, no. I spoke with Derek this afternoon. It seems he's had a change of heart about his employer. He's prepared to testify about Michael's instructions to fabricate evidence if needed." "He's willing to testify against Michael?" "Let's just say that Derek values his private investigator's license more than he values Michael's money, especially since Michael hasn't been paying his bills on time lately." That evening, Sarah and I ordered pizza and sat in the living room planning our future. The house might still be lost to foreclosure, depending on what the forensic accounting revealed, but for the first time in months, that possibility didn't terrify me. "Mom, are you really thinking about taking that job with Mr. Sinclair?" Sarah asked, carefully pulling cheese off her slice in the way that had annoyed Michael, but that I found endearing. "I don't know yet. It would be a completely different life, working for a company like that." "Different how?" "More responsibility, more pressure, but also more opportunity. And definitely more money than I'm making at the insurance company." Sarah grinned. "Different like actually being appreciated for what you can do instead of being criticized for what you're not." "Exactly like that." I set down my pizza and really looked at my daughter, this amazing young woman who'd somehow grown up wise and strong despite the dysfunction of our family. "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happens with the divorce, whatever Dad tries to do next, you and I are going to be fine. I know we are, Mom. For the first time in my life, I'm not worried about our future." My phone rang, interrupting our moment. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up, perhaps curiosity, about what he could possibly say after the day's events. "Elena, we need to talk." His voice was different than it had been in court, calmer, but with an undertone that made me uneasy. "I think we've said everything that needs saying." "Not everything. There are things about this situation you don't understand, things that could affect Sarah's future." "What kind of things?" "The kind that are better discussed in person. Can you meet me tonight? Somewhere private where we can talk without lawyers and witnesses and all the drama from today." Every instinct I'd developed over the past 2 weeks told me this was a bad idea. But there was something in his voice, a certainty that suggested he still had cards to play that I didn't know about. "If you have something to say to me, you can say it now." "Elena, please. One last conversation, just the two of us. After that, if you still want to proceed with this war you've started, so be it. But you owe me that much after 15 years. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to meet him at Riverside Park in an hour. The same place where Victoria and I had formed our alliance, now to be the site of whatever final gambit Michael was preparing. As I hung up the phone, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. But I also knew that I needed to hear whatever he had to say, needed to understand what he thought he could still accomplish after the devastating defeat he'd suffered in court. Sarah watched me with concern as I gathered my keys and jacket. "Mom, are you sure about this?" He sounded really strange on the phone. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. I'm just going to listen to whatever he has to say, and then this will all be over." But as I drove toward the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's final gambit was going to be more dangerous than anything he'd tried before. The man I'd faced in court today wasn't the husband I'd known for 15 years. That man had been desperate, yes, but also calculating and controlled. This man, the one who'd called tonight, sounded like someone who had nothing left to lose. The park was eerily quiet when I arrived, the usual evening joggers deterred by the dropping temperature. Michael stood near the fountain where children played during warmer days, his silhouette rigid against the darkening sky. As I approached, I noticed something different about his posture, a defeated slump that contradicted the confident tone he'd used on the phone. "Thank you for coming," he said without turning around. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here. What did you want to discuss that couldn't wait?" He finally faced me, and I was shocked by how much he'd aged in just one day. His eyes were bloodshot, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something that belongs to you," he said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Something I should have given you years ago." I stared at the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "The truth." He held it out to me with trembling fingers. "Elena, I've done terrible things. To you, to us, to our family. But this is the one decent thing I can still do." Inside the envelope were documents I'd never seen before. Life insurance policies with me as the sole beneficiary. Investment accounts in Sarah's name that I hadn't known existed. And most shocking of all, a deed showing that Michael had secretly purchased a small house across town 2 years ago, completely paid for and titled in my name. "I don't understand," I whispered, staring at the papers. "When the business started failing, I panicked. Instead of telling you the truth, I started making worse and worse decisions. But through it all, I was trying to protect you and Sarah. These accounts, the house, they were my insurance policy, my way of making sure you'd be okay if everything fell apart. But the surveillance, the lies about my mental health, trying to stick me with your debts. I thought if I could convince everyone you were unstable, I could make decisions for both of us. I thought I could control the situation, minimize the damage." His voice cracked. "I was so afraid of losing everything that I lost sight of what actually mattered." I looked at the deed again, noting the address. It was in a good neighborhood, close to Sarah's school, with a small garden that would be perfect for starting. Over. Why are you giving me this now? Because I saw your face in court today. I saw the woman I fell in love with 20 years ago, the one who was strong enough to fight back when cornered. I realized that all these years, I wasn't protecting you from my failures. I was protecting myself from admitting them. Michael sat heavily on a nearby bench, looking older than his 45 years. Victoria was right to leave me. You were right to fight back. I became someone I don't recognize. Someone who tried to destroy the people he claimed to love rather than face his own mistakes. What happens now? I asked, still processing this unexpected revelation. Now I face the consequences. The criminal, investigation, the bankruptcy, the public humiliation. But you and Sarah will be financially secure. The house I tried to saddle you with debt for? You can let it go to foreclosure. You have somewhere better to live now. I studied this broken man who had been my husband, trying to reconcile the manipulative predator from the courtroom with the remorseful figure before me. Michael, why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning? We could have faced this together. Because I was terrified you'd see me as a failure. I'd built my entire identity around being successful, being the provider, being the one in control. When that started crumbling, I chose to blame everyone else, rather than admit I'd made mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to avoid being seen as a failure, Michael had guaranteed his failure in every way that mattered. He'd lost his wife, his daughter's respect, his business, and his future with Victoria, all to protect an image that had never been as important to anyone else as it was to him. What about Sarah? I asked. She's still your daughter, regardless of everything else. Sarah deserves better than what I've become. Maybe someday, when I've figured out how to be honest again, we can rebuild something. But right now, she's better off with you. As I drove home with the envelope of documents on my passenger seat, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a discarded wife facing financial ruin and character assassination. Tonight, I was a woman with options, with security, with a future I could shape for myself. Sarah was waiting when I got home. Her homework spread across the kitchen table, but her attention clearly focused on my return. "How did it go with Dad?" she asked, studying my face for clues. I showed her the documents, explaining what they meant for our future. Her relief was palpable as she realized we wouldn't be losing our home to foreclosure, that her college fund was actually intact, that we had choices about what came next. "So, Dad wasn't completely terrible?" she asked hopefully. "Your father is a complicated man who made some very bad decisions. But in the end, he tried to do right by us. That has to count for something." 3 months later, I accepted the position with Sinclair Development as Director of Financial Services. The job came with a substantial salary, comprehensive benefits, and the opportunity to help other families avoid the kind of financial manipulation I'd experienced. Victoria and I had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by our shared experience of Michael's deception. She'd introduced me to her father not as her ex-fiancé's former wife, but as a brilliant financial analyst who'd uncovered a complex fraud scheme with nothing but determination and spreadsheet skills. Michael had declared bankruptcy and moved to another state, where he was rebuilding his life as a financial counselor, helping people avoid the mistakes he'd made. He sent Sarah cards on her birthday and Christmas, always with a note apologizing for the pain he'd caused and expressing pride in the woman she was becoming. The small house he'd secretly bought for us became our sanctuary, a place where Sarah and I could start fresh without the weight of old memories and broken promises. I planted roses in the front garden, the same variety my mother had grown when I was Sarah's age. One evening, as I was reviewing client portfolios on the back porch, Sarah joined me with a cup of tea and a question that had obviously been on her mind. "Mom, are you happy now?" Really happy, not just relieved that the crisis is over happy? I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? I was certainly successful, financially secure, and professionally fulfilled in ways I'd never imagined possible. But more than that, I was myself again. The woman who'd been buried under years of criticism and self-doubt had emerged stronger and more confident than ever. Yes, sweetheart, I'm genuinely happy. For the first time in years, I'm living my own life instead of trying to meet someone else's expectations. Good, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside mine. Because you deserve to be happy. You always did. As the sun set over our small but perfect garden, I thought about the woman who'd fled the country club in humiliation. Just months earlier, she'd believed she wasn't good enough, wasn't attractive enough, wasn't successful enough to deserve respect and dignity. That woman had been wrong about almost everything. But she'd been right about one thing. Sometimes endings really are beginnings, in disguise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.